Oh, all right, everyone. I've got 4 o'clock on my end, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We're so thrilled you're here to learn about Greater Yellowstone's iconic canine, the wolf. My name is Emmy Reed, and I work in the Marketing and Communications Department here at the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Before we get started, I wanted to run through a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded today so that we can share it with the supporters who were unable to make it. That link will be sent out to you tomorrow via email, so you can watch anytime or share with any friends you think might be interested in. At the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask our presenter questions. And so you can submit any questions in the Zoom chat box during the presentation or after. I will act as moderator and ask those questions out loud. Please include your name and email too, because if we do not get to your question before the end of the webinar, we'll send you a follow-up email answering your question. We're also using a feature where anything typed into the chat box is only visible to myself and my co-host. So please don't worry if you don't see those questions popping up. They are coming through to me. I will grab them and make sure that they're answered. Also like to request that all questions are kind and focused on the material from the presentation. Thank you for your patience. I'd now like to introduce our presenter, Brooke Shifrin. Brooke is GYC's Wildlife Conservation Manager and is based out of Bozeman, Montana. She leads GYC's wildlife programs aimed at preventing human-wildlife conflicts, ensuring connected landscapes, and conserving the iconic species of Greater Yellowstone, as well as their migrations and movements. Brooke promotes policies and coordinates projects that protect wolves, grizzly bears, and more. In her work, Brooke strives to use collaboration and strategic thinking to secure durable policy changes and implement innovative solutions that benefit wildlife. Outside the office, Brooke is usually found soaking up the mountain sun, rain, or snow with her husband, daughter, and 2 pups. All right, Brooke, take it away.
Thanks so much, Emmy. And thanks so much to all of you for tuning in this afternoon. I'm excited you're here. I'm Brooke, and I lead GYC's wildlife programs. For today's presentation, I plan to walk through just some basic information about wolf biology and conservation, as well as the history of wolf recovery under the Endangered Species Act. And then also their current status today. I'll also share some insights around Greater Yellowstone Coalition's approach to wolf conservation and how we engage on wolf issues in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I also want to note that while my educational background is in wildlife ecology, I am not a wolf biologist. I've just had the tremendous opportunity to learn a lot about wolves through my work in this region over the past decade, which I'm really grateful for. And a particularly formative experience for me as a young child was the first time that I laid eyes on wild wolves in Yellowstone National Park. And that was during a visit with my family. And it really, for me, catalyzed a deep appreciation for this region. And I'm sure that many of you can relate to that experience. My love for the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem was really sparked by that first visit to the park where I saw wolves, and that really set the trajectory for my career. And so it's really an honor to work to protect this place, and I'm grateful that you all are interested in the work that we do. Wolves are an incredibly valuable member of our ecosystem. They hold spiritual and cultural significance for many people. They play an important ecological role in the environments that they inhabit. And they're also a source of inspiration. And we all know they draw millions of visitors and their dollars to our region each year. And Yellowstone wolves in particular are really quite iconic and are loved by people around the world. I personally think it's very fascinating to consider how sort of old tales about the big bad wolf are kind of indicative of the human propensity to fear creatures that we don't understand, and maybe also symbolic of our collective struggle to tolerate creatures that we perceive as a threat. And the unfortunate reality is that the challenges of wolf livestock conflict are very real in the West. This challenge is, of course, worse in some places than others. The picture there on the right is a wolf feeding on a cow. But I've found it absolutely mandatory in my work to really understand and genuinely empathize with the reality that for folks who are trying to make a living on the landscape via uses that can come into conflict with wolves, like livestock production, wolves are not easy to live alongside. And I'm imagining that all of you are well aware of the very polarizing context around wolves and how they are conserved and managed. And so I just wanted to name that from the outset, because one thing that I really hope I can convey in this presentation is that from my perspective, people being willing to set their differences aside and really look for collaborative solutions, I think is sorely needed for wolves to thrive over the long term. For now, I'll just start with a little bit of basic biology and some fun facts about wolves. These animals are highly social. They live in packs and they engage in cooperative care of their pups. Wolves hunt in groups and they are extremely defensive of their territory. Here in the Northern Rockies, the primary prey species of wolves are elk, deer, and bison. And the research that has been done on Yellowstone wolves is truly world-class, and really provides a tremendous wealth of information. For example, a fun fact, and one that really inspires me personally, that is the result of research by the brilliant and dedicated scientists in Yellowstone. The black coat that you often see of wolves in the park is actually due to the presence of a single gene and a mutation associated with that gene that was believed to have originated in domestic dogs in the old world, and probably indicative of hybridization with domestic dogs in the last 7,000 years, when people brought domestic dogs across the Bering Land Bridge. Evidence actually suggests that black wolves are more likely to survive disease outbreaks, while gray wolves have a higher reproductive success and tend to be more successful in territorial disputes than black wolves. And so what has been observed is this really strong mate choice between opposite color male and female pairs in Yellowstone, which I find so fascinating because I think it's really indicative of how wolves in the park are selecting for those traits. Wolves are large. Males are around 100 to 130 pounds, females 80 to 110 pounds. So if you're ever watching wildlife and you're questioning whether you're seeing a coyote or a wolf, chances are your hesitation means you're actually looking at a coyote, because there's a really significant size difference there. And as I mentioned, wolves have been heavily studied in Yellowstone National Park. And as a result, we know that they have really massive home ranges, between 180 and 300 square miles. They live a really long time. The oldest wolf in Yellowstone, or can live a really long time, I should say. The oldest wolf in Yellowstone known was 12 and a half years old. They have litters of roughly 5 pups. They breed in February, and then the pups are born in the April timeframe. And once young are born, they actually don't come out of the den until about 2 weeks later, but the pack will stay at the den site for up to 10 weeks. I also wanted to touch on the predator-prey dynamics between wolves and ungulates, which are extremely complex, and that is often not the narrative that you see or hear really on either end of the spectrum. Usually you hear the extreme of wolves are decimating elk populations, which is not true, or the extreme of wolves have no impact whatsoever on ungulate populations, which is also not true. There are a number of factors, wolves included, but also other predators, the way that people manage ungulates, environmental factors like drought and winter severity. All of these things interplay to impact ungulate populations. In the early years of wolf recovery, wolves were primarily preying on elk calves. And over time, we've seen an increased portion of bull elk and bison, particularly bison injured during their breeding season, as well as winter-killed bison. So when it comes to protecting and conserving wolves, what is important, you might ask? Well, wolves need suitable habitat, and that means large contiguous blocks of land that provide a prey source. It's also important for wolves that there is connectivity between subpopulations of wolves, and that's to facilitate genetic exchange or interbreeding. And this is a really important strategy for buffering against disease outbreaks, which time has shown are a pretty key threat to wolves in our region. And what about challenges? In Yellowstone National Park, the average pack size of wolves is just shy of 12 wolves, and that number is much lower outside the park, potentially as low as 3 wolves in Montana. In Yellowstone, wolves live an average of 4 to 5 years, while outside the park, they may live only 2 years. In Yellowstone, and all of this is because in Yellowstone, the primary cause of death is other wolves, while outside the park, it's people. And so broadly speaking, in the Western United States, the primary stressor influencing wolf populations is human-caused mortality. And we know that human-caused mortality can fragment landscapes, which in turn negatively impacts that genetic connectivity that I just mentioned, being an important strategy for buffering against disease or other environmental changes. In our region, the primary sources of human-caused mortality are regulated harvest in Idaho, Montana, Washington, and Wyoming, lethal control of wolves depredating on livestock, and also illegal take of wolves, otherwise known as poaching. Many wildlife populations can absorb increasing mortality from humans up to a certain point. And so in those circumstances, human-caused mortality is really just replacing mortalities that would have happened by other means like starvation or disease. And so for wolves in particular, there are several mechanisms that explain how wolves are able to compensate for that. They might immigrate into an impacted area. We might see increased natality rates in wolves. The point being, they can actually absorb a lot of mortality. Once some threshold is crossed, though, then mortality becomes additive. In other words, it's not replacing what we would have seen occur naturally. And so that's when we start to see survival rates and populations decline. Many wolf biologists actually believe that wolves can compensate for human-caused mortality that represents almost 30% of the population size, which is a pretty dramatic mortality rate and actually exceeds, in most cases, what we're seeing in the states where we see a lot of wolf mortality. Before we get into GYC's wolf conservation work, I did just want to spend a little bit of time telling the story of wolf recovery in our region because it's really a tremendous conservation success story. Wolves once ranged from the Arctic tundra all the way to Mexico, and some scientists estimate that roughly 2 million gray wolves once roamed North America, including much of the contiguous United States. But a loss of habitat coupled with very extreme government-sponsored extermination programs meant that wolves were mostly gone in the lower 48 states by the early 1900s. The exception at that time was in Northeast Minnesota, where roughly 1,000 wolves remained. But throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, It was actually a policy of Yellowstone National Park to routinely remove predators, including wolves. And in 1926, the last Yellowstone National Park pack was killed. Um, there continued to be reports of single lone wolves after that, but by the 1930s, wolf populations had completely disappeared from Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Um, a few lone dispersers from Canadian populations were occasionally killed in our region. And it wasn't until the late 1980s when wolves began reproducing again in the Western United States, when some wolves from Canada denned in Northwest Montana. So, wolves were listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act in 1974, and this established a mandate for recovery. Originally, gray wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act as several different subspecies. But in 1978, the gray wolf was reclassified as an endangered species at that species level, Canis lupus, throughout the contiguous United States. Again, the exception here was in Minnesota, where wolves were classified as a threatened species rather than an endangered species. Soon after that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service appointed a wolf recovery team, which developed a recovery plan by 1980. Originally, that plan identified natural dispersal and reintroduction as the primary means to restore wolves to the Northern Rockies region. Then in 1987, the Fish and Wildlife Service revised that recovery plan and added a lot more specificity, and ultimately recommended that not only natural recovery be promoted in Northwest Montana, but that wolves be reintroduced into Yellowstone. And if by the early 1990s we didn't see two breeding pairs naturally establish in central Idaho, that wolves be introduced there as well. The final, what is called demographic recovery criterion for wolves, which is essentially the benchmark for removal from the Endangered Species Act, was 30 breeding pairs comprising at least 300 wolves equitably distributed across Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming for at least 3 consecutive years. Another important facet of that recovery criterion was genetic exchange, either natural or agency managed, if necessary, between populations of wolves in each of the states. At that time, Idaho and Montana agreed to manage for a bit more than what was the identified recovery criteria, which was 15 breeding pairs and 150 wolves. And then Wyoming agreed to manage for 10 breeding pairs and 100 wolves, and the National Park Service agreed with the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes to together maintain 5 breeding pairs and 50 wolves on their lands. All of these commitments are in an MOU with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and are codified in state law. And then in 1991, Congress appropriated money to begin a process for wolf recovery, namely a reintroduction effort. GYC was a fierce advocate for wolves and a strong supporter of reintroduction through the process that ensued. The organization engaged in many public meetings and comment periods and behind-the-scenes advocacy. Around that time, there were nearly 150 public meetings, many hundreds of thousands of comments received by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And ultimately, the plan for wolf reintroduction was completed in 1994. That plan, as expected, identified Yellowstone National Park and Central Idaho to be designated as non-essential experimental populations, and to involve reintroduction. That non-essential experimental population distinction essentially allowed for some management flexibility in order to address some of the concerns that were bubbling up from the local public which primarily had to do with the risk of conflict with livestock and the impacts on ungulate populations, mostly elk. So in 1995 and 1996, 31 wolves from Western Canada were relocated to Yellowstone. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a hard release of wolves, where they were essentially captured, transported, and immediately released in central Idaho. But there was a soft release of wolves in Yellowstone, which meant that they were acclimated in pens for many months, and then released as family groups within the park. Originally, the releases were supposed to happen in the fall so that wolves would have time to settle before the February breeding season. But at that time, both opponents and proponents of reintroduction were actually trying to halt the efforts, either because they were opposed to reintroduction or out of concern with the details of the reintroduction plan. There was a lawsuit that stalled the process, and the result was that it was March of 1995 before wolves in Yellowstone were actually released. The wolves in Idaho actually traveled pretty extensively before they settled in, but the wolves in Yellowstone that underwent the soft release settled in pretty quickly and established their home ranges. Fast forward 5 months later, and it was pretty dang clear that this was a successful effort. 13 of the 15 Idaho wolves were still alive, and 13 of the 14 Yellowstone wolves were still alive. The effort continued into 1996 when 17 more wolves were released in Yellowstone from British Columbia, and then another 20 into Idaho's Frank Church Wilderness. Originally, the plans predicted 3 to 5 years of reintroductions, but it actually only took 2 years because it was so successful. At the same time that all of this reintroduction effort was happening, the population of wolves in northwest Montana was naturally increasing via recolonization of wolves from Canada. And so by late 1996 in that area, there were roughly 7 breeding pairs and 70 wolves occupying northwest Montana. After all of this reintroduction effort, the sort of beginning of natural recolonization of wolves in northwest Montana, wolf populations in the Northern Rockies grew pretty rapidly. Probably because we have such a strong base of ungulate prey species in our region. We also have really large blocks of secure habitat. Those things likely facilitated that rebound. Other factors are that wolves reproduce really quickly. They have a strong ability to disperse really long distances, and they can really thrive under a variety of habitat conditions. And so you combine all of those things, and what was observed was nearly 20% growth rate of the wolf population in the Northern Rockies every year from 1995 to 2008. And so this graph here that I'm sure you've been examining is really just intended to be a helpful visual of that dramatic rebound over time through the late 1980s or 1990s into the early 2000s. And then the saga of the status of wolves under the Endangered Species Act began. In 2005, Idaho and Montana were given more day-to-day management flexibility, which was possible because of that designation as a non-essential experimental population under the Endangered Species Act. Between 2008 and 2011, there was a crazy amount of back and forth around delisting and relisting. Ultimately, in 2011, wolves were delisted in Idaho and Montana by action of US Congress. In 2012, there was a congressional directive to delist wolves in Wyoming. They were then relisted in Wyoming in 2014 and then delisted again in Wyoming in 2017 by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And so since that time, since 2017, All states in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem have had delisted wolf populations. In 2021, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned by a collection of groups to relist wolves in the Northern Rockies or across the entire Western United States. In response to this, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a status review and just issued a decision this past February, which essentially maintained the delisted status of wolves in the Northern Rockies. And so where do things stand today? This map shows current and historic range of wolves, with the green area on the map representing historic range, and the yellow area representing current range. As a little side note, that kind of gray area down in the lower portion of the map is the current range of the Mexican gray wolf, which is a subspecies. As I just mentioned, because wolves in the Northern Rockies are not listed under the Endangered Species Act, they're under state and tribal management authority. Wolves remain classified as a threatened species in Minnesota and endangered in the remaining lower 48 states. Currently, there's sort of three subpopulations in our Northern Rockies region. Those are in Northwest Montana, Central Idaho, and then down here in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Those subpopulations are fairly connected with one another. In other words, there's some gene flow and exchange happening. Wolves routinely disperse between these areas and interbreed. That said, there is some indication that at least some portion of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem might remain somewhat isolated from other subpopulations. And so the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is kind of the southernmost tip of that yellow band in Wyoming. Although, well, let's see, in 2022, the states actually estimated that there were 2,797 wolves across 286 packs across 7 different states. And so that's a very large population with broad distribution and a lot of genetic diversity. And so the population is really quite resilient at this point. I think it's important to remember that wolves were once extirpated in the lower 48, and now this is the situation. So we have indeed come a long way. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has said that as long as populations are maintained above minimum recovery levels, because of the high reproductive capacity of wolves and what's really a large amount of suitable habitat in the Western United States, wolves are likely to remain a viable population in the Northern Rockies that is capable of withstanding the threats that we can anticipate at this point in time into the foreseeable future. And so right now, the state of Wyoming estimates they have around 150 wolves across 10 packs. Montana's estimate hovers around 1,100 wolves and 180 packs. In Idaho, it's around 1,300 wolves. And then we know that there are at least 124 wolves and 10 packs in Yellowstone National Park. The management paradigm for wolves in Wyoming is very different than Idaho and Montana. And so Wyoming has established what's called a trophy game management area. And I want to direct your attention to that map on the far left of the slide. And so the state boundary in that map there is Wyoming. The red boundary represents Yellowstone National Park and Grand Teton National Park. And so that trophy game management area is that kind of yellowish polygon. The objective in that area is to maintain their recovery criteria commitment, which is 10 breeding pairs and 100 wolves. That management area is seasonally expanded, which is that blue polygon in the lower left corner of the map. The purpose of that is to facilitate that genetic exchange between wolves in Wyoming and wolves in Idaho. And then outside that boundary, that trophy game management area boundary, in the rest of the state of Wyoming, wolves are actually classified as predators, which means that there are zero regulations on the take of wolves. They can be taken at any time, in any way, by any means. And that is certainly very hard to stomach. However, something that we've found is that the result of that paradigm is that within the trophy game management area, where resources for managing for wolves on the landscape are concentrated, we've seen that there are very conservative harvest seasons and that there's pretty intensive, robust monitoring by the state of Wyoming within that area. In Idaho, the state's objective is to manage for 500 wolves. Idaho has been very clear about an intention to manage for a population reduction toward that objective, and has also been very clear about prioritizing reducing livestock depredations and impacts on big game populations, and has actually stated that they will deprioritize non-lethal conflict prevention measures until that stated objective has been achieved. In Montana, the management direction is very similar. Montana's draft wolf management plan has a benchmark of 450 wolves to support 15 breeding pairs. The general paradigm is very similar to Idaho. In the event that the population estimate actually approached 450, then that would trigger much more intensive monitoring in Montana. And so this is just a very challenging management paradigm to be working in wolf conservation. When you couple the state management plans with state legislative activities, it starts to paint a bit of a tough picture for wolves in our states, where the focus really is on managing wolves, reducing populations, and there really are no places that are prioritized for wolves and the benefits that they provide on the landscape. In 2021, both the Montana and Idaho legislatures passed bills intended to decrease wolf population size in their states. The premise of the policies was that population reduction was necessary to reduce impacts on livestock and big game populations. And as I'm sure you can imagine, there are a lot of flaws in that logic. The statutes allowed for longer seasons, an increase in or complete removal of individual bag limits for hunters, the legalization of questionable methods of harvest like night hunting, snaring, baiting. There were also some other changes to harvest practices. For example, it is now legal to receive reimbursement for harvesting a wolf in Idaho and Montana. And, that is something that I find eerily similar to the bounty programs that characterize those early 1900s extermination programs. The Fish and Wildlife Commissioners in both Idaho and Montana have subsequently applied these policies pretty aggressively, even though they aren't required to do so, and kind of to the extent that they've perceived to be legally allowable without violating the Endangered Species Act. And even that is currently in question. You may have seen some recent news about lawsuits in Montana and Idaho that halted expanded wolf trapping seasons because of the potential risks that those could pose to grizzly bears outside of denning periods. That graphic there is Montana's wolf harvest dashboard, and I included it because I just wanted to illustrate the coarse approach that is taken to wolf management, where large quotas are applied to massive geographies that actually don't have any biological meaning for wolves. At the same time, there's also some growing concern about the methods that Idaho and Montana are using for estimating wolf abundance. The essence of that being that Idaho and Montana don't actually conduct counts of wolves. In other words, they don't have a minimum number of confirmed wolf observations. Both states use modeling methods that are based on other data sources, and those models rely on a lot of assumptions that in some cases don't actually reflect reality, or you could make a case don't reflect reality. And so there's a lot of work underway by a number of folks to really understand to what degree these problems are impacting the state's population estimates, with a general sense that they may be leading to some overestimation. And of course, that has big implications. But I do think it's important to note that despite the aggressive policies, despite some uncertainty about exactly how many wolves we haven't actually seen a notable change in the number of wolves harvested statewide in recent years. And I think it's also really important to keep in mind the big picture and the long-term prognosis for wolves in the Western United States. You know, the geographic scale, the time scale that you're considering really matters. And at this time, the data does not indicate that wolves are in danger of going extinct in the Northern Rockies. And so I say all that just to highlight that perhaps some of these concerns with state management might fall outside the scope of the Endangered Species Act as a tool to recover species that are in danger of extinction. And so, because of all that, GYC's approach is really all about working collaboratively to make incremental and positive changes to state management policies that make things better for wolves. It is no doubt an uphill battle because of that polarizing context that I alluded to at the beginning. But that said, I really mean the collective we there. It's not just GYC, but so many partners, agency staff, engaged citizens, business owners that we get to work with. All of us have had some success by starting small and really looking for middle of the road solutions. And so I wanted to share one example of that here. 2 years ago now, the wolf hunting and trapping season in Montana resulted in nearly 20 Yellowstone National Park wolves getting killed in the 2 wolf management units bordering the park to the north, which are circled on the map there. This was the result of some of the Montana Fish and Wildlife Commissioners voting to remove what had previously been a low wolf quota in those units. And I should note, these low quotas were something GYC advocated for and fought hard to secure alongside many others around the time that wolves were first delisted. And so the removal of the quota for the 2021-2022 season essentially created an unlimited harvest opportunity of wolves just across the park boundary. And this was really problematic for Yellowstone wolves in particular, because Yellowstone wolves are not as wary of humans. And there are actually geographic pinch points in these units that wolves travel to move across the landscape and cross the park boundary, which, by the way, these wolves that were killed only probably spent 4% of their time outside the park boundary. And so the geography of these spots just makes them very vulnerable to hunter harvest. So we worked really closely with other NGO partners in the business community in Paradise Valley to make a compelling case for the negative economic impacts of the wolf hunting and trapping season on gateway communities where many businesses are actually reliant on wildlife tourism, with wolves really being the star of the show there and the reason why so many people visit and spend money in the communities surrounding the park each year. Losing roughly 20% of the park wolf population that year had a really tangible impact on wildlife watching opportunities. And so, as I said, after a very large collective effort around this issue, coupled with some bold action by Yellowstone National Park asking the state for a compromise solution, all of that resulted in the commission reinstating a quota of 6 wolves in that area just outside the park. Obviously, we'd like to see that quota lower, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. While this alleviated some pressure and reduced the impact of the wolf harvest season structure on Yellowstone wolves, we're still seeing challenges here. Again, due to the geographic nature of the hunt unit, that quota of 6, while a major improvement from an open season and a free-for-all, can still result in the elimination of entire packs. And it sounds like maybe 2 packs have dissolved as a result of this year's wolf hunt. So now we're working with that same set of partners and decision makers to identify and secure yet another improvement that could mitigate the potential for these negative impacts on Yellowstone wolves. And what we found is that the economic arguments are particularly compelling for decision makers here in Montana. One outcome of the collective effort to reinstate the quota was a robust assessment of the economic benefits wildlife watching and tourism provide in Montana. This infographic is out of the Montana Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research and was not a part of that assessment, but I think tells a compelling story about the benefits that our iconic wildlife provide to the state when they stay on the landscape alive. And so there at the bottom, you can see of the many millions of visitors that come to Montana, 28% cite wildlife watching as their reason for the visit. And the assessment that I just mentioned indicated that in Park County, Montana, which includes the Yellowstone National Park Gateway community of Gardner, visitors spend over 236 million, and tourism creates over 3,000 jobs. And I want you to just take note of that statistic that I circled in red at the bottom. It is estimated that wolves alone bring 82 million annually to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So we are trying to build on some of the incremental progress that we've made in the Yellowstone Boundary Unit. We're expanding our scope, working with many of the same partners, and trying to identify opportunities for addressing other concerns with wolf management in Montana more broadly. Over the long term, our goal is really to secure places in the state where management practices via conflict response and harvest seasons prioritize the valuable role that wolves play on the landscape. We also, of course, want to see some improvements to current monitoring methods, or at least how the monitoring methods are being applied in a management context. It's important that abundance estimates are accurate and reliable well into the future. Through this work, I've found that, we're creating a lot of productive relationships and finding people of all walks who really do want to see more moderate and balanced approaches to wildlife management in our region that are science-based and recognize the myriad benefits that wolves provide. Just a little bit about some of our other work that benefits wolves. GYC works to protect ungulate migrations and movements. We do that through coordinating, supporting, funding, implementing a variety of on-ground projects that really are focused on making landscapes more permeable for wildlife. For example, we work on removing fencing barriers or replacing fencing with wildlife-friendly modifications. We work on wildlife crossing infrastructure, which it provide really effective solutions for protecting the daily and seasonal movements that elk and mule deer and pronghorn need to make to meet their basic needs. And as you know, healthy ungulate populations mean a healthy prey source for wolves in our region. We also partner with ranchers to prevent predator conflicts. All of that supports wolf conservation as well. For example, range riding is a practice that can help mitigate the risk of wolves depredating on livestock, which means less wolves lethally removed as a result of conflict. So I hope I've illustrated what a conservation comeback story wolves represent in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and also that there are challenges that remain. And GYC is, really trying to find durable solutions to these challenges in the midst of pretty significant polarization in people's views of wolves and how they should be managed. You can donate to our work using the QR code on the screen or via that URL on the slide. And now I think we've got about 15 minutes to answer some of the questions that have been coming in.
Yes, thank you, Brooke. I really appreciate you presenting, and we definitely got some questions. So if folks also want to put those in the chat, we do have a lot coming in, so I'll do my best to grab those. Please put your first and last name in case we don't get to your question so that we can follow up with you after the presentation. Brooke, let's get started with, we've got a question. What is your organization doing about the horrible wolf abuse incident, in Wyoming?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what happened there was truly horrifying. And the reality is that in Wyoming, as I said, when I kind of showed that map, wolves are classified as predators in roughly 85% of the state. And so, again, that means that there are really no regulations on how or when wolves are killed. And so they can be taken by any means at any time. And so, sadly, the implication of that policy is that the only charge that Wyoming Game and Fish could apply in that incident was really just related to a violation of possessing live wildlife. There's a pretty narrow set of circumstances where treatment of predators can be classified as animal cruelty and in turn be punishable under state law. And all of which I'm sure is undergoing investigation right now. All of that is just context to say that um, the root issue here, or one of the root issues here, is those state laws that make killing predators by any means, which in this case involves someone chasing a wolf down with a snowmobile, legal. And this is exactly the kind of example of policies that are not grounded in science, and aren't sort of through the lens of wolves having a place on the landscape. And that's exactly the kind of stuff that GYC is working to improve at the state level.
Great, thank you, Brooke. Let's see. Got another question. Could you talk a bit about how have you partnered and communicated with tribes about managing wolf populations?
Yeah, and I'll just say that is a huge area for growth for not just GYC, but I'd say most conservation organizations working on these issues in our region. Um, and that's unfortunate because the tribes manage a lot of land that wolves occupy and play a really significant role in this larger picture. It's something that we're exploring as GYC has expanded our work through our new strategic plan and built a tribal program, really trying to figure out how our work on wolf issues intersects with tribal priorities. And so I hope in future presentations that we'll have more to offer there because I think we all recognize that there's a lot of work to do in that realm.
Great, thank you, Brooke. Could you talk a bit about this really specific term with predator and how that influences management? Because you talked a bit about how Wyoming wolves are called predators. And so could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and so that's actually a legal term in Wyoming statute alongside other classifications. For example, trophy game would be a classification. And so, that definition lives in Wyoming statute. And There are a number of wildlife species that are classified as predators in Wyoming, like skunks, coyotes, foxes. And really, what that means in practice is that the take or killing of those species is not regulated in any way through a hunting season, through permits. Really, you are legally allowed to take those species however you'd like, whenever you'd like. And of course, that is very hard to stomach as a conservationist, but that is the reality of sort of the paradigm there that we're working in.
All right, thank you. Um, we've got a question about, or could you tell us, with the reintroduction of wolves, how has that influenced any other wildlife populations? You talked a bit about the ungulates.
Mhm.
Are there any other wildlife species that it had an effect on?
That's a good question. I mean, I think so much energy and attention has been applied toward understanding how wolves impact ungulate populations, which they certainly have had an impact alongside many other factors, as I mentioned earlier. We do know that wolves being on the landscape is really beneficial for species like crows and ravens that scavenge on the leftovers of a carcass after a wolf kill. And then that applies then to other scavengers as well, like coyotes, foxes, things like that. So wolves really do play really this critical role within the ecosystems that they operate, and have kind of a ripple effect on a number of different things.
Love it. Thanks, Brooke. Um, let me get to another one. Might be one we need to follow up on, but this is an interesting one if you know anything about it, Brooke. I've been reading that Molly's pack has been currently hanging out in the Lavar Valley instead of the Pelican Valley. Does anyone, you or anyone, have any idea what's going on?
Yeah, I'm so glad someone asked about that. Yeah, that's correct. That is happening. And it happens from time to time, where the Molly's pack will show up in the Lamar Valley. I actually have a really cool story to tell on that front. Several years ago that happened, and my husband and I were lucky enough to be traveling through the park during that time period, and we actually witnessed a wild sort of fight go down between the Junction Butte pack and the Molly's pack, because the Molly's pack was sort of encroaching on the other pack's territory. And so that was just fascinating to see wolf packs chasing each other like across the entire length of the valley. One of the coolest wildlife watching experiences I've had. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, wolves are very territorial, but they do have really big home ranges, and will venture pretty far in search of what they're looking for, which is often a food resource. And so it's not surprising that they might dabble in places that they don't typically spend time.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see. Brooke, do you know of any cases of chronic wasting disease in wolves from infected ungulates?
Hmm. I don't know the answer to that question, but we can definitely tap into some of the amazing partners we work with and see if we can get an answer and follow up via email.
Sounds good. That. All right. Brooke, could you talk a bit about use the term harvested a lot, and definitely know some of the folks in the chat have a hard time with that word. Can you talk about why that word is used and why you use that word?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. I use that word because that's the word that the state agencies that are responsible for establishing wolf management plans and the state commissions that are responsible for defining the parameters of wolf hunting and trapping seasons in the states that we work in, that is the term that they use. And so it's almost just second nature that's the term for engaging on these issues with the decision makers who can make meaningful changes for wolves. But I can definitely see how that term is challenging because it implies that you're actually that someone is taking a wolf and using the wolf for something like a food source, or like, I mean, it conjures images of big game hunting or gardening even, and that is often hunting wolves is done purely for the purposes of retrieving a trophy. And so the term is not exactly consistent with what's going on, perhaps. But it's the term that is kind of thread throughout the paradigm of the management frameworks and really the conversation in our states. And so it's how we meet the decision makers where they're at when we're working on these issues.
Got it. Thank you. All right, so it's a little bit, it's been talked about that there is a recent wolf introduction in Colorado. Do you know if there are any other states or just, states that are considering a reintroduction as well?
I'm not sure. I mean, I definitely have heard rumblings of, other Western states who where there's interest in the idea. I don't know of any beyond Colorado that have real substantive traction at this point. I could be wrong there, though. I mean, my lens is so hyper focused on the Northern Rockies and the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so I might just be disconnected to the bigger picture there.
All right. We touched on this a little bit earlier, Brooke, with just other species. Do you have anything to share about how wolves affect a watershed, beaver populations in particular?
Hmm. Yeah. So, and there's, when it comes to any scientific theory, it is often up for debate, and there's competing ideas and understandings of scientific phenomenon. But there is a strong contingent of the scientific community that really believes that evidence indicates that wolves have this sort of trophic cascade effect on the environment they inhabit. And so what that means is, wolves help regulate ungulate populations. When ungulate populations are well regulated to their natural environment, that they're less likely to overgraze or overbrowse on species like willows. And that then in turn has, positive benefits for other species as well, like beavers.
Great, thanks, Brooke. Again, we're just about out of time. I've collected everyone's questions who put them in the chat. If you're also able to, please put your email or at least your last name so that we can find your name in the registration list and follow up with you on these questions. There's been a lot, so thanks for bearing with me as I pull all that information out. But I just really wanted to say thank you to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much to Brooke for sharing her knowledge and work. You guys make our conservation work possible, and we appreciate how much you care about this remarkable ecosystem. If you'd like to support our work, there's the QR code there. There'll also be a link to donate in tomorrow's email. That email will also contain a survey about the webinar. We would love your feedback and to do our next webinar and improve upon. We'll also include a link to the recording, so you're able to again share it or watch it at any time. Again, we really appreciate everyone being here and caring about this place, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.